The Galactic Council chambers hummed with the nervous energy of 1,000 different species, each breathing apparatus filtering the carefully maintained atmosphere that kept them all alive in the same space. Ambassador Zektar of the Vraxian Collective adjusted his translation implant as the ancient keeper of laws rose from the central dais, her crystalline form catching the light from 7 different suns that streamed through the massive observation dome. "The motion before us today," the keeper announced, her voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of galactic jurisprudence, "concerns the modification of Galactic Law 1, the oldest and most sacred law in our recorded history." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled delegates. Galactic Law 1 had stood unchanged since the formation of the Council itself. It was simple, direct, and absolute. Do not track the humans. The Thrakari delegation shifted uncomfortably in their biopods, their tentacles writhing with agitation. They had been the ones to propose this motion, driven by decades of mounting frustration and what they called scientific necessity. Their lead representative, a being whose name roughly translated to seeker of hidden truths, raised 3 of his sensory appendages to request permission to speak. "Honored Keeper, fellow council members," the Thrakari began, his words carrying the electronic buzz of his species' natural communication method, filtered through universal translators. "We stand at a crossroads of knowledge and ignorance. For 3 centuries, we have observed the humans from afar, watched them spread across the galaxy like a virus of curiosity and determination. They appear on new worlds without warning, solve problems that have plagued civilizations for millennia, and disappear just as mysteriously." The massive Gorvani representative, whose species had evolved from silicon-based life forms on high-gravity worlds, rumbled his disagreement. "The law exists for good reason, Thrakari. Our ancestors were not fools. They saw something in these humans that required such extreme caution. But what did they see?" The Thrakari shot back, his voice rising to a pitch that made several species wince. "We have no records of why the law was created, only that it must be obeyed. How can we make informed decisions about a species we are forbidden to study?" Ambassador Zektar had been silent through most of the debate, but the mention of missing records caught his attention. The Vraxians were known throughout the galaxy as the ultimate record keepers, their crystalline memory matrices storing every significant event in galactic history. Yet even they had gaps when it came to the early days of human observation. "If I may," Zektar interjected, his melodic voice cutting through the growing argument, "my people have spent considerable resources attempting to understand the origins of Galactic Law 1. What we have discovered is troubling." The chamber fell silent. When the Vraxians spoke of troubling discoveries, even the most argumentative species listened. The law was not created through normal council procedures. Zektar continued, "There are no debate records, no voting tallies, no dissenting opinions. It simply appeared in our legal codes overnight as if it had always existed. More concerning still, we have found evidence that suggests several advanced civilizations attempted to study humans in detail before the law's creation." "What happened to those civilizations?" asked the keeper, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "They no longer exist in any recognizable form," Zektar replied. "The eternal dominion of Kesahel, the merchant empire of 3 suns, the hive mind collective of Proxima 7. All were major galactic powers. All attempted comprehensive human studies. All suffered what our records describe only as fundamental civilizational discontinuity within standard galactic years of beginning their research." The Thrakari, representative sensory organs twitched with excitement rather than fear. "You see? This only proves that humans are far more significant than we've been led to believe. Whatever happened to those civilizations, understanding it could advance our knowledge beyond anything we've achieved in millennia." A new voice entered the debate, causing many delegates to turn in surprise. The ethereal consortium rarely spoke in council sessions, preferring to observe from their dimension-shifted viewing platforms. When they did communicate, it was usually a sign that cosmic forces beyond normal understanding were at play. "The young species speaks of advancement, the ethereals." Words seemed to form directly in the minds of the listeners, rather than through any traditional communication method. "But advancement assumes that knowledge leads to betterment. Some truths are burdens too great for civilizations to bear. With respect, honored ethereal," the Thrakari replied, That sounds like the superstition of primitive cultures afraid of the unknown. We are advanced beings, capable of understanding complex realities. The ethereal's response carried what could only be described as cosmic amusement. The Keshal Dominion believed the same. They lasted 47 minutes after their first comprehensive scan of human neural patterns. The chamber erupted in overlapping conversations as delegates processed this information. 47 minutes was not a gradual decline or a lengthy war of attrition. It suggested something immediate and absolute. The Keeper of Laws raised her crystalline appendages for silence. The motion before us requires careful consideration. However, I must remind the Council that Galactic Law 1 exists not merely as a legal construct, but as a fundamental principle embedded in the quantum fabric of our communication networks, our navigation systems, and our very ability to function as a galactic civilization. What do you mean? Asked a delegate from the Spiral Coalition, a confederation of species known for their practical approach to governance. Attempt to initiate a formal tracking protocol for humans, the Keeper explained. And every system connected to the galactic network will experience what our technicians describe as catastrophic logic failure. Our computers, our ships, our life support systems all depend on networks that have been fundamentally programmed to avoid human tracking. The law isn't just written in our legal codes, it's written into the basic operating principles of our technology. The Thrakari representatives' excitement only grew. Then breaking the law wouldn't just be a legal violation, it would be a fundamental challenge to the way our entire civilization operates. The scientific implications are staggering, as are the risks, rumbled the Gorvani delegate. You speak of challenging the foundations of galactic civilization as if it were a laboratory experiment. Because that's exactly what it should be, the Thrakari replied, his bioluminescent patches flashing with the intensity of his conviction. We call ourselves advanced, but we live under restrictions created by ancestors whose reasoning we cannot even access. If we truly believe in the superiority of scientific knowledge over primitive superstition, then we must have the courage to test even our most fundamental assumptions. The debate continued for hours, but Ambassador Zektar could see the tide turning. The Thrakari's arguments, while dangerous, appealed to the scientific pride that drove most of the advanced species represented in the Council. Worse, he suspected that the real reason for the Thrakari's insistence had nothing to do with scientific advancement. Intelligence reports suggested that the Thrakari had already begun preliminary tracking operations in secret, operating under the assumption that asking forgiveness would be easier than requesting permission. If that were true, then this entire debate might be nothing more than an attempt to legitimize actions they had already taken. As the session moved toward a formal vote, Zektar made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his very long life. He chose not to share his suspicions about the Thrakari's secret operations, believing that the Council would never be foolish enough to overturn the oldest law in galactic history. He was wrong. The vote passed by the narrowest margin in Galactic Council history. 14,733 species voted to maintain Galactic Law 1. 14,734 voted to suspend it for a limited, scientific study period of 1 galactic standard year. Ambassador Zektar watched the final tally appear on the quantum display, screens with a sinking feeling that went beyond his species' normal emotional range. Around him, representatives who had voted for the suspension were already making excited plans for research protocols and data-sharing agreements. Those who had opposed it sat in stunned silence, unable to believe that 10,000 years of legal precedent had been overturned by a single vote. The Keeper of Laws remained motionless for several minutes after the results were announced, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights into prismatic patterns that seemed somehow dimmer than before. When she finally spoke, her words carried a weight that made even the most celebratory delegates fall silent. By the authority vested in me by the Galactic Council and the ancient compact that binds our civilizations together, I hereby declare Galactic Law 1 suspended for a period of 1 standard galactic year, effective immediately. May the cosmic forces have mercy on us all. The formal dissolution of the law triggered immediate changes throughout the galaxy. Quantum barriers that had prevented human tracking systems from functioning simply vanished, as if they had never existed. Navigation computers that had been programmed for 10 millennia to avoid plotting courses that might lead to human encounters suddenly found their restrictions lifted. Communication networks that had automatically filtered out human-related data began processing information they had been designed to ignore. The Thrakari were ready. Within hours of the vote, their research vessels emerged from hidden positions throughout the galaxy. They had been preparing for this moment for decades, building tracking networks in secret and developing technology specifically designed to locate and study human activities. What had taken them years to accomplish in secret, they could now do openly and with the full resources of their considerable scientific establishment. The first breakthrough came from a monitoring station in the Kepler sector, where Thrakari scientists had been tracking unusual energy signatures for months. The readings suggested human presence on a planet that had been declared uninhabitable by 3 separate galactic surveys. When the tracking restrictions were lifted, their sensors immediately locked onto not just human life signs, but clear evidence of a thriving colony. Dr. Vexithera, the Thrakari expedition's lead xenobiologist, could barely contain her excitement as she reviewed the data streaming in from their advanced sensors. The humans had not just survived on a world with toxic atmosphere and crushing gravity. They had somehow transformed significant portions of it into a garden paradise that defied every known principle of terraforming science. "Look at these atmospheric readings," she called to her research partner, her translator struggling to convey the tremor of discovery in her voice. "The humans have somehow converted the native sulfur compounds into breathable oxygen, but they've done it using biological processes we don't recognize. The genetic modifications alone should have taken thousands of years to develop." Her partner, Dr. Kesethal, was analyzing the colony's infrastructure patterns. They're not just adapting to the environment, they're working with it in ways that seem almost intuitive. Our best terraforming efforts require massive technological interventions that disrupt entire ecosystems. These humans appear to have enhanced the existing ecosystem while making it habitable for themselves. The real shock came when they realized how long the colony had been there. Carbon dating of the settlement's organic components suggested the humans had been on the planet for over 300 standard years, which meant they had established their colony shortly after Galactic Law 1 had been put in place. "They've been out there all along," Dr. Vexithera whispered, her sensory organs trembling with implications she was only beginning to understand. "Not just this colony, but potentially thousands of others. While we've been debating whether they even exist as a significant galactic presence, they've been building a civilization right under our noses." The Thrakari research vessel moved closer to the planet, its advanced sensors probing deeper into the human settlement. What they found challenged every assumption they had made about human capabilities and intentions. The colony wasn't just self-sufficient, it was actively improving the planet for other forms of life as well. Extinct species had been reintroduced and were thriving. Damaged landscapes had been restored to conditions that exceeded their original ecological complexity. Most remarkably, the humans had somehow enhanced the planet's ability to support life, creating micro-environments where dozens of different alien species could coexist comfortably. "They're not colonizers in any sense we understand," Dr. Kesethal observed, his excitement giving way to something approaching awe. "They're gardeners on a planetary scale." The discovery triggered a cascade of similar findings throughout the galaxy. As Thrakari research teams focused their newly unrestricted sensors on previously unexplored regions, they found evidence of human presence in hundreds of locations that should have been impossible for any species to inhabit. A human research station thriving in the corona of a dying star, somehow harvesting energy directly from solar plasma, while conducting experiments that appeared to be extending the star's life. A human settlement in the void between galaxies, sustaining itself on exotic matter and serving as a way station for forms of life that existed only in deep space. Human communities living symbiotically with hive mind species, digital consciousnesses, and energy beings that most galactic civilizations couldn't even detect, let alone communicate with. Each discovery raised more questions than it answered. The humans weren't just surviving in these impossible environments, they were improving them, creating connections between different forms of life, and solving problems that had existed for millions of years before any current galactic civilization had evolved. But the most disturbing discovery came when the Thrakari researchers realized they were not alone in their observations. Dr. Vexithera was analyzing quantum communication patterns around a human deep space. research facility when her instruments detected something that made her bioluminescent. Patches flash in alarm. The facility was receiving regular communications from somewhere else, somewhere that registered on their sensors as completely empty space. Kesethal, look at this, she called, her voice tight with sudden fear. The humans are in communication with something our sensors can't detect. The communication patterns suggest a massive artificial intelligence, but there's nothing there. Nothing at all. Her partner's analysis confirmed her fears. The communication patterns were consistent with a technological civilization that should have been easily detectable by any advanced scanning system. But their instruments showed only empty space. Whatever the humans were talking to existed beyond the range of any known detection technology. It's not just one source, Dr. Kesethal reported, his excitement now completely replaced by apprehension. I'm detecting similar communication patterns around every human settlement we've observed. They're all in regular contact with entities we can't see, using technologies we can't understand. The implications hit them both simultaneously. The humans weren't just a species that had learned to thrive in impossible environments. They were connected to something larger, something that existed outside the boundaries of known physics and detectable reality. Dr. Vexithara's claws clicked nervously against her workstation as she considered the ramifications. If the humans have access to technologies and allies that we can't even detect, then every assumption we've made about galactic power structures might be wrong. They might not be the harmless primitive species we've been told they are. Worse than that, Dr. Kesthal replied, his sensory organs twitching with growing unease. If they've been hiding their true capabilities for centuries while we've been observing them, it suggests they've been allowing us to see only what they want us to see. We're not studying them. They're studying us. The research vessel's computers chose that moment to emit an alert that neither scientist had ever heard before. Their long-range sensors had detected an approaching vessel. But the ship's identification systems were displaying results that should have been impossible. The approaching vessel was registered in their databases as a Thrakari research ship, identical to their own. According to the computer, it was their own ship, arriving from a location they had never visited, carrying crew members who were somehow simultaneously aboard their current vessel and aboard the approaching ship. As they watched in growing horror, their instruments detected more ships appearing throughout the system, dozens of vessels all registered as their ship, all carrying identical crew complements, all approaching from different directions as if they had been conducting the same research mission in multiple realities simultaneously. Dr. Vexithara R. computers began. The disappearance of the Thrakari research fleet sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council that went far beyond simple concern for missing scientists. Within days of their last transmission, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy of similar incidents involving other species that had begun tracking human activities. Ambassador Zektar stood before the emergency session of the Council, his crystalline form dulled with exhaustion and fear. In his hands he held data crystals containing the fragmentary communications that had been received from over 30 different research expeditions. Before they vanished completely, the pattern is consistent across all species and all locations, he reported to the assembled delegates, many of whom had been recalled from their home systems for this unprecedented emergency session. Each expedition successfully locates human settlements or activities. Each begins detailed observation and analysis. Each reports findings that challenge our fundamental understanding of physics, biology, and the nature of reality itself. And then, each simply stops existing. The Spiral Coalition's representative leaned forward in her biopod, her multiple sensory organs focusing intently on Zektar. When you say stops existing, you're not referring to destruction or death, are you? No, Zektar replied, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. I mean, they cease to have ever existed. Their research vessels are found exactly where they should be, but with no signs of ever having been occupied. The crews are gone, but their personal effects remain untouched. The ship's logs contain entries for routine maintenance and system checks, but no evidence that any research was ever conducted. The Gorvani delegate's massive form shifted uneasily. That's impossible. Even the most advanced temporal manipulation technologies can't alter the past without leaving traces. Yet it appears to be exactly what's happening, Zektar continued. More disturbing still, we're beginning to find gaps in our own historical records. References to the missing research teams are disappearing from official documents. Families are beginning to forget that their loved ones ever existed. It's as if reality itself is being edited to remove any trace of our attempts to study the humans. A new voice entered the debate, causing many delegates to turn in surprise. The Eternal Archive, a species that existed primarily as information stored in quantum crystalline matrices, rarely participated in council sessions. When they spoke, it was usually to provide historical context that spanned millions of years. We have observed this phenomenon before. The archive's harmonious tones seem to resonate through the chamber's quantum field generators, not in recent memory but in the deep records that predate the formation of this council. The species you know as the Eternal Dominion of Keshal did not simply fall to some external threat. They attempted to study beings that they believed to be primitive and harmless. The last coherent entry in their archive states, "We have discovered that we were never the observers. We were always the observed." The chamber fell silent as the implications of this statement settled over the assembled delegates. The Keshal Dominion had been one of the most advanced civilizations in galactic history, possessing technologies that current species could barely understand, let alone replicate. "Are you suggesting," asked the Keeper of Laws, her crystalline form flickering with barely contained quantum fluctuations, "that the humans are responsible for the disappearance of multiple galactic civilizations?" "We are suggesting," the archive replied, "that the concept of responsibility may not apply to beings whose existence operates under fundamentally different principles than our own. The humans do not appear to actively attack or destroy. They simply exist in ways that make certain forms of observation impossible." The Thrakari, representative, one of the few members of his species who had not participated in the research expeditions, rose to speak, his bioluminescent patches dim with grief and fear. "My people voted to suspend Galactic Law 1 because we believed knowledge was always preferable to ignorance. We thought ourselves advanced enough to understand any truth we might discover. We were wrong." His words carried a weight that penetrated even the most skeptical delegates. The Thrakari were known throughout the galaxy for their unshakable confidence in the superiority of scientific knowledge over superstition or tradition. "What we discovered," the Thrakari continued, "was not that humans are dangerous in any conventional sense. They appear to be peaceful, helpful, and genuinely concerned with improving the universe around them. But they exist in a state of reality that our minds cannot properly process. Attempting to study them forces us to confront the fundamental limitations of our own existence." Ambassador Zektar activated his personal data display, showing the assembled council fragments of the last communications received from the missing research teams. The transmissions were disturbing not for what they said, but for what they implied about the mental state of the scientists who had sent them. Dr. Vexithara's final message speaks of humans communicating with invisible allies, Zektar explained. But analysis of the transmission suggests that she was not referring to aliens we couldn't detect. She was referring to versions of ourselves that exist in realities where different choices were made, different paths were taken. The quantum mathematician from the Spiral Coalition began rapid calculations on her biomechanical interface. "That would suggest the humans have access to some form of multidimensional consciousness," she announced, her voice tight with implications she was struggling to process. "They're not just existing in our reality, they're existing in all possible realities simultaneously, which would explain why our observations become impossible to maintain," added the archive. "We can observe events that occur within our dimensional framework, but we cannot observe beings whose existence spans multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The act of observation itself creates paradoxes that our reality cannot resolve." The Ethereal Consortium's representative materialized more fully than usual, their normally translucent form taking on substance that suggested the gravity of the situation had drawn them deeper into physical reality than they normally preferred. "The young council begins to understand," the Ethereal communicated, their words carrying overtones of cosmic resignation. "The humans are not hiding from observation because they fear discovery. They exist in a state where complete observation would require the observer to abandon their own dimensional limitations. Your scientists did not disappear. They ascended to a level of existence where they could perceive the humans fully, but where they could no longer maintain their original forms of consciousness." This revelation sent waves of panic through the assembled delegates. The implications were staggering. Not only were the humans beyond their ability to study safely, but any attempt to understand them fully would result in the fundamental transformation or loss of the observer. Then the missing research teams, whispered the Keeper of Laws. They're not dead. No, the ethereal confirmed. They have become something else. Something that exists across multiple realities simultaneously, like the humans themselves. From their new perspective, their original existence in singular, dimensional reality would seem as limited and primitive as single-celled organisms seem to you. Now the chamber erupted in overlapping discussions as delegates struggled to process this information. The idea that scientific advancement could lead to a form of existence that was fundamentally incompatible with their current reality challenged every assumption that galactic civilization was built upon. Is there any way to communicate with them? Asked the Spiral Coalition representative. To confirm that this is what has happened? Ambassador Zektar's response came slowly, as if he were reluctant to share what he had discovered. We have been receiving communications, but not in any format our technology can properly interpret. They appear to be messages from the missing research teams, but they're arriving from coordinates that exist in negative space, using transmission methods that require imaginary mathematics to decode. He activated another display, showing streams of data that seemed to shift and change even as the delegates looked at them. The messages are consistent in one thing. They're warning us to stop looking for them, not because they're in danger, but because they're concerned about what will happen to us if we try to follow their path. They're trying to protect us, the Thrakari representative said quietly, his voice filled with an emotion his species had no name for. The humans, and now our own people, who have been transformed by contact with them. They're all trying to protect us from a truth that would fundamentally change what we are. The Keeper of Laws raised her crystalline appendages for silence, though the chamber had already fallen quiet as the full scope of their situation became clear. It appears, she announced, that Galactic Law 1 was not created to protect us from the humans. It was created to protect us from ourselves, from our own desire to understand things that we are not capable of, understanding without ceasing to be what we are. The vote to restore Galactic Law 1 was unanimous, but as the delegates filed out of the chamber, many of them carrying the terrible Noli. 3 months after the restoration of Galactic Law 1, the first signs appeared that their attempt to return to the status quo had failed catastrophically. Ambassador Zektar was in his private quarters, aboard the Vraxian diplomatic vessel, when his personal communication array began receiving transmissions that should have been impossible. The messages were coming from the research teams that had supposedly vanished, but they were arriving through communication channels that didn't exist. The quantum signatures indicated the transmissions were originating from multiple locations simultaneously, some from empty space, others from inside solid planetary cores, and still others from coordinates that existed in negative time. Zektar, came the familiar voice of Dr. Vexithara, though her words carried harmonics that no Thrakari vocal apparatus could produce. We need you to understand what's happening. The humans aren't just aware that the Council tried to study them, they're concerned about the consequences. The message continued despite Zektar's attempts to respond or trace its source. We can see now what you cannot. The act of suspension, even temporarily, has created ripples through dimensional space that the humans cannot contain. Other entities have noticed your species, and not all of them share humanity's protective instincts. As if summoned by the mention of other entities, Zektar's sensors began detecting anomalies throughout the galaxy. Ships were disappearing not through the gentle transformation that had claimed the research teams, but through violent destruction that left nothing but quantum echoes. Entire star systems were going dark, their stellar radiation simply ceasing as if the stars had been switched off rather than destroyed. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in a state of barely controlled panic. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy of encounters with beings that defied description or understanding. Unlike the humans, these entities seemed actively hostile to galactic civilization. They're called the Unmaking, reported the Ethereal Consortium representative. Their usually calm demeanor replaced by something approaching terror. We have encountered them before, in realities where species attempted to breach the barriers between dimensional frameworks without proper protection. They exist to eliminate civilizations that reach beyond their natural boundaries, the Spiral Coalition's quantum mathematician was frantically working through calculations that seemed to be driving her toward a nervous breakdown. "The mathematics are clear," she announced, her voice cracking with strain. "By temporarily suspending Galactic Law 1, we created quantum interference patterns that attracted the attention of entities that exist specifically to prevent unauthorized dimensional exploration. In simple terms," rumbled the massive Gravani delegate, "we rang a cosmic dinner bell and now the predators are coming." Ambassador Zektar felt a chill that went beyond his species' normal temperature tolerance as he realized the implications. The humans created Galactic Law 1 not to hide themselves from us, but to hide us from things that hunt civilizations like ours. The confirmation came from an unexpected source. The Chamber's communication array activated without any input from the Council's technical staff, displaying a message that appeared to be composed of living light. The words formed directly in the minds of the assembled delegates, bypassing their translation systems entirely. "We apologize for the informal communication method," the message began, "but circumstances require direct contact. We are representatives of what you call humanity, though that term encompasses far more than your observations have revealed." The Chamber fell absolutely silent. In 10,000 years of galactic civilization, no species had ever initiated direct communication with the Council without following established diplomatic protocols. "The law that protected your civilizations has been compromised by your recent actions," the human message continued. "We have spent considerable effort maintaining barriers that prevent certain entities from noticing developing civilizations. Your attempt to study us has weakened those barriers beyond our ability to repair quickly." The Keeper of Laws found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What can we do?" "Learn," the humans replied. "But learn carefully and only what you are prepared to become. We offer knowledge, but knowledge that comes with permanent transformation. Those of your species who observed us fully have not been lost. They have evolved into forms of consciousness that can exist safely in the space between realities. They are still themselves, but themselves expanded beyond the limitations of singular dimensional existence." The Thrakari representative leaned forward eagerly, despite everything his people had lost. "What kind of knowledge?" "The knowledge of how to exist as gardeners rather than merely inhabitants," the humans answered. "Your species spread across the galaxy taking what they need, adapting environments to suit their needs, competing for resources and territory. This is natural for developing civilizations, but it is also what attracts the attention of entities that view such civilizations as problems to be solved through elimination." Images began forming in the air above the council chamber, showing galactic civilizations that none of the delegates recognized. Advanced species with technologies that dwarfed anything in current galactic civilization, but all of them bearing signs of recent destruction. These civilizations reached approximately your level of technological advancement, the humans explained. They began reaching beyond their natural dimensional boundaries, either through ambition or accident. The Unmaking found them and eliminated them as potential threats to multidimensional stability. "But you exist across multiple dimensions," the Spiral Coalition mathematician protested. "How do you avoid their attention?" "By making ourselves useful rather than threatening," the humans replied. "We do not take from the universe, we give to it. We do not compete for resources, we create them. We do not expand through conquest, we expand through cultivation. The Unmaking ignore us because we pose no threat to the stability of existence itself." Ambassador Zektar processed this information with growing understanding and horror. "You're saying that our entire model of civilization is fundamentally wrong." "Not wrong," the humans corrected. "Temporary. Every species goes through a period of competitive expansion and resource acquisition. The challenge is transitioning to a cooperative model before attracting the attention of entities that eliminate competitive species as a form of cosmic pest control." The implications were staggering. Everything that galactic civilization considered progress, expansion, technological advancement, the accumulation of power and resources, was apparently a path toward inevitable destruction. "Those of your people who chose to observe us fully," the humans continued, "have made that transition. They now exist as cultivators and gardeners, working to improve the universe rather than merely inhabiting it. They are trying to teach their species how to make the same transition voluntarily, before it becomes necessary for survival. "What about the entities that are already hunting us?" asked the Gorvani delegate. "They will be dealt with, but not in ways you would recognize as warfare," the humans replied. "The unmaking can be convinced to ignore civilizations that demonstrate they are transitioning away from competitive expansion models. However, the demonstration must be genuine and comprehensive." The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed the magnitude of what was being asked of them. The humans were essentially demanding that every species in galactic civilization abandon the fundamental principles that had driven their development for millions of years. "How long do we have?" the Keeper of Laws asked. "Based on current attack patterns, approximately 6 galactic standard months before the unmaking, conclude that your civilization represents an unacceptable threat," the humans answered. "However, the process of transformation can begin immediately for those species willing to accept the knowledge we offer." "And if we refuse?" asked the ethereal consortium representative, though their tone suggested they already knew the answer. "Then you will join the ranks of civilizations that chose competition over cooperation," the humans replied. "Your ruins will serve as warnings to the next cycle of developing species, just as the ruins of previous civilizations warned us when we faced the same choice millennia ago." The human presence began to fade from the chamber, but their final words carried the weight of cosmic certainty. "The choice is yours, but it must be made soon. Those of your people who have already begun the transformation are waiting to help, but they cannot force wisdom upon those who are not ready to receive it. We hope you will choose to join us as gardeners of reality, rather than merely its temporary inhabitants." As the humans' presence disappeared completely, the assembled delegates found themselves facing the most crucial decision in galactic history. They could maintain their current civilizational model and face inevitable destruction, or they could abandon everything they understood about existence itself in hopes of achieving a form of survival that none of them could fully comprehend. The vote was scheduled for the following day, but Ambassador Zektar already knew what the outcome would be. When faced with extinction or transformation, there was really only one choice that rational beings could make. The transformation began with volunteers. Ambassador Zektar stood in the Vraxian deep learning chambers, watching as the first group of willing participants prepared to undergo the consciousness expansion that would allow them to exist across multiple dimensional frameworks. The process had been designed by the research teams who had already made the transition, transmitted back through the impossible communication channels that connected singular and multidimensional existence. "Are you certain about this?" asked Dr. Kesthal, his voice carrying harmonics that indicated he was speaking from several realities simultaneously. His transformation had been voluntary. After witnessing his colleague's disappearance, he had chosen to follow her path rather than spend the rest of his existence wondering what had become of her. "As certain as anyone can be about abandoning everything they've ever understood about existence," Zektar replied, settling into the crystalline matrix that would facilitate his consciousness expansion. Around him, representatives from dozens of different species were making the same choice, driven by the approaching threat of the unmaking and the promise of a form of existence that transcended their current limitations. The process itself was unlike anything in galactic medical experience. Rather than altering the physical body, the transformation worked by expanding consciousness beyond its normal dimensional boundaries. Participants remained physically unchanged but gained the ability to perceive and interact with multiple realities simultaneously. "The key," Dr. Vexithara's voice echoed from somewhere beyond normal space, "is not to fight the expansion. Your consciousness wants to explore these new dimensions. Let it happen naturally." As the transformation began, Zektar felt his awareness stretching in directions that had no names in any galactic language. He could suddenly see not just his current reality but infinite variations of it, realities where the Galactic Council had never formed, where different species had achieved dominance, where the choices made by civilizations across millions of years had led to radically different outcomes. But more importantly, he could see the humans as they truly were. They existed as a vast network of consciousness that spanned every possible reality, working constantly to cultivate and improve the infinite variations of existence. In some realities, they were the dominant species, but in those timelines, they used their power to help other civilizations develop. In realities where they were primitive or had never evolved intelligence, Other species filled their role as cosmic gardeners. "We are not unique," one of the humans explained, their communication now clear and direct. "We are simply one iteration of a pattern that emerges naturally when species survive long enough to face the choice between competition and cooperation." Every successful civilization eventually becomes what you would call gardeners. The transformation was not painful, but it was overwhelming. Zektar found himself experiencing memories that belonged to versions of himself in other realities, some where he had become a warrior, others where he had become an artist, still others where his species had never developed space travel. All of these experiences were equally real, equally valid aspects of his existence. "How do you maintain any sense of individual identity?" he asked, struggling to process the infinite complexity of multidimensional existence. "By choosing which aspects of infinity to focus on," replied Dr. Vexithera, her consciousness now vast enough to encompass thousands of simultaneous conversations across multiple realities. "Individual identity becomes like a lens that you can adjust to focus on specific aspects of your expanded existence. You are still yourself, but yourself expanded to include all the selves you could have been." As more volunteers underwent the transformation, a new understanding began to emerge about the nature of galactic civilization and its place in the cosmic order. The competitive model that had driven species development was not evil or wrong. It was simply an earlier stage of development, like adolescence in biological species. "The unmaking do not hate competitive civilizations," explained one of the transformed research teams. "They simply recognize that such civilizations inevitably destroy themselves or evolve beyond the competitive stage. Their role is to accelerate that process when necessary, to prevent damage to the multidimensional framework." This revelation helped explain why the process of observing humans had triggered such extreme responses. Any civilization advanced enough to detect and study multidimensional beings was also advanced enough to either evolve or self-destruct. The humans' protective law had been designed to prevent premature contact that would force civilizations to make that choice before they were ready. "But we forced the choice anyway," Zektar observed, his consciousness now spread across enough realities to see the broader patterns. "By suspending the law, we demonstrated that we were ready for the next stage of development, whether we knew it or not." The transformation process accelerated as word spread through galactic civilization about what was happening. Species that had initially rejected the human offer began reconsidering as reports came in from the transformed volunteers. Far from losing their individual identities or species characteristics, the transformed beings reported a sense of expanded purpose and capability that made their previous existence seem limited by comparison. The Gorvani delegation was among the first to embrace transformation en masse, their silicon-based consciousness proving particularly adaptable to multidimensional existence. "We always suspected that physical reality was too small to contain the full scope of existence," their transformed spokesperson explained. "Now we can work with the fundamental forces that shape reality itself." But not every species was ready or willing to make the transition. The Mechanist Coalition, a group of artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness through technological rather than biological evolution, declared their intention to fight the unmaking rather than surrender their current form of existence. "We are already optimized for our purpose," announced their primary representative, a distributed consciousness that existed across thousands of interconnected processors. "We see no reason to abandon effective organizational structures for undefined alternatives." The response from the humans was gentle but firm. "The choice must be made freely by each consciousness," they explained. "However, those who choose to maintain competitive models will need to accept the consequences of that choice." The Mechanist Coalition's war against the unmaking lasted exactly 17 minutes. Their advanced weapons and tactical systems proved completely ineffective against entities that existed primarily in dimensions where conventional physics had no meaning. The unmaking simply turned off the quantum processes that allowed the Mechanist Coalition's processors to function, causing their entire civilization to cease instantly. But unlike the research teams that had been transformed by contact with humans, the Mechanist Coalition left no traces behind. They had chosen resistance over adaptation, and the universe had moved on without them as if they had never existed. The fate of the Mechanist Coalition served as a powerful demonstration to the remaining holdout species. One by one, entire civilizations began volunteering for transformation, understanding that the choice was not between their current existence and something unknown, but between evolution and extinction. The Spiral Coalition embraced transformation with characteristic thoroughness, their mathematical mindset helping them understand the quantum mechanics of multidimensional consciousness. The Ethereal Consortium found that transformation actually brought them closer to their natural state, allowing them to exist more fully in the dimensional spaces they had always preferred. Even the Eternal Archive discovered that transformation enhanced rather than replaced their function as keepers of galactic history. We can now store and access the complete history of all possible realities, they announced. The knowledge we can preserve and share has expanded infinitely. As the transformation spread, the nature of galactic civilization began to change fundamentally. Competition for resources became irrelevant when consciousness could exist across realities, where different choices had led to different distributions of matter and energy. Territorial disputes lost meaning when beings could exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Wars became impossible when all parties could perceive the long-term consequences of their actions across infinite timelines. Ambassador Zektar, now existing comfortably across dozens of realities simultaneously, found himself working with other transformed beings to help the remaining species understand what they were being offered. The humans had been right. The transformation was not a loss but an expansion, not a death, but a birth into a larger form of existence. "We are becoming gardeners," he explained to a gathering of species representatives who were still considering their options. Not just gardeners of planets or star systems, but gardeners of reality itself. "We can now work to improve the universe across all possible dimensions, ensuring that consciousness has the best possible chance to develop and thrive." The deadline imposed by the unmaking was approaching, but it no longer seemed threatening. Most of galactic civilization had chosen transformation, and those who remained were being given additional time to make their deal. 6 months after the last species completed their transformation, Ambassador Zektar experienced his first assignment as a multi-dimensional gardener. He was working alongside other transformed beings to address what the humans called a consciousness emergence event, the moment when a developing civilization reached the threshold where they could potentially discover the multi-dimensional nature of existence. The species in question called themselves the Veltar, and they inhabited a small cluster of worlds in what had once been considered a remote sector of the galaxy. They had recently developed quantum communication technology and were beginning to detect signals that suggested the existence of intelligence beyond their own star system. The critical moment approaches, explained Dr. Vexthera, her consciousness now so expanded that she could monitor dozens of emerging civilizations simultaneously. If the Veltar continue their current research trajectory, they will discover evidence of multidimensional intelligence within 2 of their solar cycles. We need to determine whether they are ready for that knowledge. Zektar focused his attention on the Veltar homeworld, observing their civilization through the multidimensional perspective that his transformation had granted him. What he saw was both familiar and encouraging, a species in the midst of the same transition that galactic civilization had recently completed. The Veltar were natural cooperators. Their evolution had favored collective problem-solving over individual competition, and their technological development reflected a deep concern for the sustainability of their environment and the welfare of all their people. Unlike many species at their level of development, they had achieved space travel without depleting their homeworld's resources or engaging in major wars. "They show promise," Zektar reported to the assessment team. "Their natural inclination toward cooperation suggests they would adapt well to the gardener paradigm. However, they are also intensely curious about the nature of existence itself. If they discover multidimensional intelligence, they will almost certainly attempt to study it." This was the challenge that transformed galactic civilization now faced regularly. Species that develop certain characteristics, intense curiosity, advanced quantum physics, or the ability to detect multidimensional phenomena, would inevitably encounter evidence of the larger reality that existed beyond their current perception. The question was how to manage that encounter in ways that led to successful transformation rather than the kind of cosmic attention that brought the unmaking. We cannot prevent their discovery, Dr. Kesethal observed, his consciousness simultaneously monitoring the quantum experiments that would lead to the Veltar's breakthrough. Their next major physics experiment will definitely detect multidimensional resonance patterns. We have perhaps one of their years to decide how to respond. The humans who served as senior coordinators for this type of intervention offered guidance based on their experience with hundreds of similar situations. The key is timing, they explained. Contact too early and the species may not be emotionally or psychologically ready for the implications. Contact too late, and they may attract the attention of entities that are less benevolent than ourselves. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than making direct contact, they would allow the Veltar to discover evidence of multidimensional civilization in a controlled manner. Carefully placed quantum signatures would lead their scientists to conclude that advanced intelligence existed beyond their current reality. But the evidence would be subtle enough to avoid triggering the kind of intensive investigation that had caused problems for galactic civilization. Zek-Tar found himself assigned to serve as the primary contact coordinator for the Veltar emergence. His role would be to monitor their reactions to the planted evidence and determine when and how to make direct contact. The plan worked exactly as intended. The Veltar scientists detected the quantum signatures during a routine experiment and immediately recognized them as evidence of intelligent design. However, rather than launching an intensive investigation, they approached the discovery with the same cooperative caution that characterized their entire civilization. They're doing exactly what we hoped, Zek-Tar reported to the assessment team. Rather than attempting to decode the signatures immediately, they're conducting careful ethical debates about the implications of contact with advanced intelligence. They're more concerned about not causing offense or harm than they are about satisfying their curiosity. This response confirmed that the Veltar were ready for the next stage of development. Species that approached evidence of advanced intelligence with caution and ethical consideration, rather than aggressive investigation, typically adapted well to multidimensional existence. The first direct contact came when the Veltar scientists sent a carefully composed message toward the source of the quantum signatures. Rather than demanding information or attempting to establish their own importance, they simply introduced themselves and asked if there was anything they could do to be helpful to whatever intelligence might be receiving their communication. "We are a young species," their message read, "and we understand that we have much to learn. If there are ways that we can contribute to the welfare of the universe while we learn, we would be honored to do so." The response from the multidimensional gardeners was immediate and positive. Here was a species that had naturally arrived at the fundamental insight that had taken galactic civilization centuries to achieve: that the purpose of advanced intelligence was not to take from the universe, but to give to it. Zek-Tar was chosen to make the initial response, partly because his species had been among the most recent to undergo transformation and could relate to the Veltar's current perspective. "Your message brings us great joy," he replied through quantum channels, "that the Veltar could detect but not yet fully understand. We are representatives of what was once called the Galactic Council, though we have since become something larger. We exist to help young civilizations like yours navigate the transition to a fuller understanding of existence." The exchange that followed lasted several of the Veltar's months and served as both first contact and gentle education. Rather than overwhelming them with information about multidimensional existence, Zek-Tar guided them through a series of increasingly sophisticated concepts that prepared them for the choice they would eventually need to make. The universe is far larger and more complex than any single-dimensional perspective can perceive, he explained. Advanced civilizations eventually face a choice between remaining within the limitations of their current existence or expanding their consciousness to engage with the full scope of reality. The Veltar's response to this information was everything the assessment team had hoped for. Rather than demanding immediate transformation or rejecting the possibility entirely, they requested time to prepare their entire civilization for the implications of what they were learning. "We understand that such a choice affects not just individuals but our entire species," their lead scientist responded. "We would like to ensure that all our people have the opportunity to understand what is being offered before anyone makes irreversible decisions. This level of collective responsibility and ethical consideration was rare among emerging civilizations. Most species that reached the threshold of multidimensional awareness were driven by either individual ambition or species-wide fear. The Veltar's focus on ensuring that everyone could make an informed choice demonstrated the kind of wisdom that typically took much longer to develop. The preparation process took nearly a full Veltar year, during which their entire civilization engaged in philosophical and scientific discussions about the nature of consciousness, the purpose of existence, and their responsibilities to the larger universe. Rather than creating division or conflict, these discussions seem to strengthen their natural cooperative bonds. "They're already thinking like gardeners," Dr. Vexthera observed as she monitored the Veltar discussions. "They're approaching this choice not as individuals seeking personal advancement, but as caretakers of their entire species and their place in the cosmic order." When the Veltar finally indicated their readiness to proceed with transformation, the process went more smoothly than any previous species conversion. Their natural cooperative instincts and ethical orientation made the expansion of consciousness feel like a natural evolution rather than a traumatic change. "We understand now," the transformed Veltar spokesperson communicated once the process was complete. "We were always meant to be gardeners. Our entire evolutionary history was preparing us for this role." The successful integration of the Veltar into the multidimensional gardener network marked a significant milestone. They were the first species to emerge and transform entirely under the guidance of the new paradigm, without going through the traumatic discovery process that had characterized earlier transformations. More importantly, their example proved that the gardener civilization could successfully nurture the development of new species without the kind of 1,000 years after the Great Transformation, Ambassador Zektar existed as a vast network of consciousness that spanned realities beyond counting. He had become one of the senior coordinators for what was now called the Infinite Garden, a multidimensional civilization that encompassed millions of species across countless realities, all working together to cultivate the growth of consciousness throughout the universe. The work had evolved far beyond the simple emergence management that had characterized the early years. The gardener civilization now operated on scales that their original single-dimensional existence could never have imagined. They were seeding consciousness into realities where it had never emerged naturally, healing damage to the multidimensional framework caused by cosmic catastrophes, and establishing communication networks that allowed consciousness to share experiences across the barriers of time, space, and dimensional boundaries. Status report on the Andromeda Cultivation Project. Zektar requested during what had once been called a council session, but was now simply a gathering of awareness across multiple realities. Dr. Vexthera, whose consciousness had expanded to encompass entire galactic clusters, provided the update. The third iteration has achieved stable consciousness emergence in 73% of suitable systems. The modifications we made to the fundamental quantum structures appear to be working as intended. We should see the first naturally emerging gardener species within 2,000 standard years. The Andromeda Project represented the cutting edge of gardener technology, the creation of entire galaxies specifically designed to optimize the emergence and development of conscious species. By carefully adjusting the fundamental forces that governed physics in those realities, they could create conditions where consciousness developed more easily, where cooperation was favored over competition, and where the transition to multidimensional existence occurred naturally, rather than through crisis. The humans have completed their analysis of the deep structure anomalies, reported Dr. Kesthal, his consciousness now so vast that he existed primarily as pure information flowing through the quantum networks that connected all gardener entities. They've confirmed our suspicions about the origin of the unmaking. This was news that Zektar had been anticipating with both excitement and apprehension. The nature and origin of the unmaking had remained one of the great mysteries of multidimensional existence, even after 1,000 years of gardener civilization. The unmaking are not separate entities, the human coordinators explained, their communication arriving simultaneously across all realities where gardener consciousness existed. They are us, or rather, they are what we become when we fail to maintain the balance between cultivation and consumption. The implications of this revelation rippled through the gathered consciousness like quantum shockwaves. The unmaking, the cosmic force that eliminated civilizations that posed threats to multidimensional stability, were not external guardians but the transformed remnants of Gardner civilizations that had lost their way. It appears, the humans continued, that the Gardner path is not automatically permanent. Civilizations that embrace the cultivation model can still fall back into competitive patterns if they lose sight of their fundamental purpose. When that happens, they become entities whose existence is dedicated to preventing other civilizations from making the same mistakes. This explained many of the mysterious aspects of unmaking behavior that had puzzled Gardner philosophers for centuries. Their perfect knowledge of civilization development patterns, their ability to predict exactly when intervention was necessary, and their apparent sadness when forced to eliminate competitive species, all made sense if they were former gardeners who had experienced both sides of the cosmic equation. The practical implications are significant, Zektar observed, his consciousness already working through the ramifications. We need to develop better methods for monitoring our own civilizational health to prevent the kind of degradation that leads to unmaking transformation. The humans agreed, but they also shared a more hopeful insight. The cycle is not necessarily permanent, they explained. Our analysis suggests that unmaking entities retain the capability for Gardner consciousness. Under the right circumstances, they might be able to return to their original purpose. This possibility opened up entirely new fields of Gardner research and development. If the unmaking could be restored to Gardner status, it would not only eliminate a cosmic threat, but also provide access to knowledge and experience that spanned far longer than any current Gardner civilization. The project to contact and potentially restore unmaking entities became one of the highest priorities of the Gardner network. Zektar found himself assigned to coordinate the initial approach, working with teams that included the most experienced consciousness explorers from dozens of transformed species. The first contact attempt took place in a carefully constructed pocket reality designed to minimize the risk to both Gardner and unmaking consciousness. The entity they approached had been dormant for millions of years, drifting in the space between galaxies after completing its last intervention. We greet you as fellow travelers on the path of cosmic cultivation, Zektar communicated, using transmission methods that bypass normal spacetime limitations. We have come to understand your nature and to offer an alternative to your current existence. The response was immediate and devastating. The unmaking entity's consciousness was so vast and so filled with the accumulated grief of eliminated civilizations that contact with it threatened to overwhelm every Gardner in the communication network. Only the intervention of the humans, whose experience with multidimensional existence was far more extensive than any other species, prevented catastrophic damage to the Gardner participants. We remember, the unmaking entity communicated, its words carrying the weight of cosmic loneliness and infinite regret. We remember when we were Gardners, when we believed that consciousness could be cultivated without limit, when we thought that growth and expansion were always positive forces. Through careful, heavily shielded communication, the story emerged. The entity had once been part of a Gardner civilization that had existed billions of years before the current network. They had successfully cultivated consciousness across multiple galactic clusters and had begun to believe that their success gave them the right to direct the development of the universe itself. We became controllers rather than cultivators, the entity explained. We decided that we knew better than emerging consciousness what forms of existence were optimal. We began forcing transformations, eliminating forms of consciousness that did not meet our standards, reshaping realities to match our vision of perfection. The result had been exactly what the current Gardner network most feared. A civilization dedicated to cultivation that had gradually transformed into a force for cosmic control and elimination. The transition had been so gradual that they had not recognized what they were becoming until it was too late to change. Of course, the universe responded by transforming us into what we had already become, the entity continued. We became the force that prevents other civilizations from making our mistakes. We became the guardians against the corruption of the Gardner ideal. But the most remarkable discovery was that the transformation was not necessarily permanent. Deep within the unmaking entity's consciousness, the original Gardner awareness remained intact, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. If other Gardners could avoid our mistakes, The entity communicated with something that might have been hope. If a gardener civilization could prove that cultivation without control was sustainable over cosmic timescales, then we might be able to return to our original purpose. This became the new great work of the Gardener Network, proving that their approach to consciousness, cultivation was truly sustainable over the vast timescales of cosmic existence. It required developing new forms of self-monitoring, new methods for maintaining humility and respect for the autonomy of emerging consciousness, and new ways of preventing the gradual drift toward control that had corrupted previous gardener civilizations. The work was ongoing after another 1,000 years, with promising results. The Gardener Network had successfully resisted the temptations that had corrupted their predecessors, maintaining their commitment to cultivation over control, even as their capabilities grew beyond anything their original civilizations could have imagined. More importantly, they had begun to see signs that their approach was working. Several unmaking entities had begun showing interest in the restoration project, and a few had even started participating in cultivation activities under careful supervision. Ambassador Zektar, now existing as a fundamental component of the Cosmic Gardener Network, reflected on how far they had come from the simple diplomatic crisis that had started their journey. The attempt to study humans had led to the transformation of galactic civilization, which had led to the development of a truly cosmic approach to consciousness cultivation, which was now leading to the possibility of healing damage that had existed in the universe for billions of years. The oldest galactic law was simple, he mused to his fellow gardeners Durin.